Okay. Good evening and welcome to our webinar, The Vocation of the Family. I'm Jay Schaefer, the production coordinator for the Catholic Apostolate Center, and I'll be your host this evening as we welcome our guest speaker, Tim Muldoon. Tim is an award-winning author and Catholic theologian, and we're very pleased to have him speaking with us this evening about the recent apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send me a message in the chat box on the bottom right of the screen, and I'll give you a hand. And I'll turn it over to Tim and leave you in his capable hands.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all of you who are joining us either live or through the recorded webcast. I will take you through the large themes that the Pope's recent document surfaces. I'll try and provide a little bit of background. And so let me just get right to the task and talk about the agenda for this roughly 45-minute presentation, followed by whatever questions or comments follow. I'll start with a brief exploration of the history behind the document and really the history behind the theology of marriage as it developed in the Catholic Church in the West. That section, like I said, will be relatively brief because I want to spend the bulk of the time addressing the themes in the document. But before getting to that in section 3, I'll talk a little bit about discernment, which is a central focus in the document. And it's a fascinating dimension of the treatment. It's I think, very characteristically Jesuit, which it makes sense because, as I'm sure many of you know, Pope Francis is our first Jesuit Pope, and the theme of discernment figures heavily in his pastoral theology, and just even in his conversation. The word discernment shows up a great number of times, as I'll point out in the document. So I want to say something about what that term means in the context of Ignatian spirituality, which is, of course, the spirituality of Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order. So I think it's important to understand something about that theme in order to understand how it plays such a central feature in the document itself. So the last section, as I indicated, will focus specifically on Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love. It's a relatively recent document published on March 19 of 2016. It, of course, is the fruit of the Synod of Bishops that was addressing marriage, and as such, it's known as a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which just means that this was the document that was meant to capture the conversations that took place within the context of that synod. And what's interesting is he's very careful about trying to point to the various regional conferences of bishops that contributed to the document. So he's really trying to make it not only a statement by Pope Francis, but very much a statement by the bishops gathered in the church for the purpose of reflecting on this important question of marriage, and in particular, the difficult questions that face pastoral ministry toward the married and towards those which are in what are canonically known as irregular situations. And that just means situations that don't follow the rule. That's a Latinism. Irregular literally means just not according to the rule. So don't read too much into that. We'll get to that a little bit later, but that's just a little bit of a map of what to expect in this presentation. So, first of all, the vocation of the family in historical and theological context. And this is the part that I'll try and move through rather quickly. But I want to spend first a little bit of time on that word vocation, because it's a rich term certainly in the history of Catholic spirituality. It's an important term in Ignatian spirituality, and it's a term that's important in Pope Francis's own vocabulary and in the document. So vocation is something to which a person is called by God. The slide you have before you is a painting by Caravaggio, which Pope Francis himself refers to in an earlier document. It's the call of Matthew. And Matthew is the tax collector that is, seriously engaged in this money counting, and Jesus is pointing to him using a finger that's very reminiscent of Michelangelo's God creating Adam. But here's this guy saying, "Who, me?" And the idea is that for Pope Francis, who refers to this painting in his own description of why he chose the papal motto that he did, which is in Latin, miserando atque eligendo, mercying and choosing. Jesus has mercy on Matthew and yet calls him to something great, to be a disciple. And that's a great, rich image for vocation as well, that God calls us to something great and deep and wonderful. And to use that term of marriage is important. Historically, of course, it's been more often referred to as a call specifically to priesthood or to religious life. As we see in the document, there's a very, very strong emphasis that marriage is a vocation. This is not a new idea, but it's a very strong emphasis in the document. That marriage is a vocation to which God calls people for some particular part in the building of the kingdom of God. So that's a very rich theme. But it was not always so in the history of Catholic reflection on marriage. So what we see in the Roman era, for example, we're talking 1st century, 2nd century, we see that the church is basically adopting household codes that were abroad in the Roman era. We, in fact, see very specific language from Roman jurists appropriated in the canons around marriage. So this phrase that I have in the slide, consortium omnis vitae, comes from the Roman jurist Ulpian, and it was his description of what a marriage is. It's a partnership for the whole of life. And that language, interestingly, finds its way into canon law and stays there for hundreds of years. It's fascinating to see the way that language just was appropriated, because basically the understanding was marriage is just something that's already out there. It's not something that Christ invented. It's not something that is the property of any particular government. It's just something that's there in the created order, and that's evident through the law of nature. So what we find again in the Roman period is that the Christians are just saying, yeah, the Romans are already doing marriage. We'll do that, but then we'll go into a church and have it blessed. And so there is this sense that the church's role is really to raise to the level of a sacrament that which is already there in the created order. More on that shortly. But where you have the beginnings of a more crystallized theology of marriage is in somebody like St. Augustine. He's not the only one. One could also point to somebody like Tertullian a little bit earlier. One could point to Jerome. One could certainly point to other figures like Gregory of Nyssa. But Augustine is the one that has the key influence in the West. And so I focus on him here. And in particular, I focus on his description of what he calls 3 ends of marriage. And in Latin, proles, fides, sacramentum, which are translated offspring, proles, faith, fides, and sacrament is our English word, although that sort of begs the question, well, what was a sacramentum in the Roman world? Well, a sacramentum was an oath or a pledge given by a person that holds the person answerable to the gods. And we're talking in the pre-Christian era. There was such a thing as a sacramentum. So it's a pledge. It sacralizes the oath itself, or it sacralizes the item that's given as a pledge. And it could be money, it could be a wax seal, but that thing becomes a sacramentum. It becomes proof that one has pledged oneself to the gods. And so in the 3rd century, Tertullian, whom I mentioned a moment ago, argued that no Christian ought to actually do this, ought to swear a sacramentum. Why? Because, well, soldiers in the Roman Empire had to swear a sacramentum in order to execute their duty. And for Tertullian, the only sacramentum was baptism. That is the only thing that amounts to a pledge to God that one upholds in the manner of one's life. So that's really the beginning of the Christian understanding of the sacrament. So when Augustine shows up a little bit later than Tertullian, he's saying that there's something of that sacramentum that's in marriage. It's something that is made holy by virtue of the oath that spouses swear to each other before God. That's the origin of our sacramental theology around marriage. Now, what's interesting to note as we go on is that marriage, in fact, is not actually named a sacrament in the strictest sense until really about the 14th, 15th century. So it's the last of the 7 sacraments to be designated specifically as a sacrament. You do have much, reflection on marriage following Augustine, but you don't actually have a codification of sacramental theology around marriage until the Council of Florence, which is 1431 to 1449. You've got some precedents before then, but it's just simply to say that that there was a long period of near a millennium between Augustine and the Council of Florence, when you don't even really have this very solid understanding that marriage is, in fact, a sacrament of the church, the way that baptism or Eucharist or reconciliation is a sacrament. So that's just an interesting insight into a little bit of the historical development. Well, and why was that the case? Well, because there were stumbling blocks. Specifically, it was a lay sacrament. In other words, it was understood that those that contracted marriage, and the language was always legal, so contracted marriage, were lay people. They weren't members of the clergy. They were just, a man and a woman saying, yes, I will marry you. And for many, there wasn't much of God in that, so to speak. I mean, that just was a contract that was, legally binding, that states had to oversee. Eventually, the state did. Eventually, bishops did. But there was some suspicion over whether marriage could be designated as a holy thing, and specifically for somebody like Augustine and others following him, the question of sexuality kind of got in the way. Whereas, well, let's say it this way. For many, it was a stumbling block precisely because it was a fleshy thing. It didn't seem to bear the trace of the divine, particularly in the framework that was becoming certainly common in Augustine's time, namely Neoplatonism. Now, I'm getting a little technical. I don't mean to. I'm just simply pointing out something within history that made some people question whether marriage really belonged within the context of the sacraments. What really tipped the scale, interestingly, was the recognition that Jesus was incarnated in a family. There was the recognition that even in figures like Joachim and Anna, that's the icon to the right of the screen, the parents of the Virgin Mary, sexuality was part of the creation that God called men and women to participate in bearing children. So there was recognition that that even in spite of these problems, marriage had a particular place in the kingdom, and therefore was important to reflect on as part of the sacraments of the church. I'll run through this very, very quickly to jump ahead and make a major leap and say that by the 20th century, you've got the development of canon law around marriage, and in fact, a great deal of development of canon law around marriage, more than any other topic in the Code of Canon Law that was published in 1919 and again in 1983. But you still have the retention of this Augustinian approach to the ends of marriage, proles fides sacramentum. But in the 20th century, you have the emergence of a more personalistic approach in figures like Dietrich von Hildebrand, Herbert Dahms, and especially eventually in Pope John Paul II. And one symptom of this move towards a more personalist approach, away from a juridical approach, is this language of there being 3 goods of marriage, not necessarily 3 ends of marriage. So there are 3 goods. So people have children, people are faithful to one another, and people are partaking in this sacrament. These are all goods of marriage. And by the time you get to the Second Vatican Council, there's this very strong emphasis on personalism. in two documents in particular, Gaudium et Spes, which is the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, and then in Apostolicam Actuositatem, which is the decree on the laity. And both of those, of course, deal with the way that lay people, and married people in particular, participate in the upbuilding of the kingdom of God. The language is very warm, and we'll see an example of that in this slide. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's section 48 from Gaudium et Spes, and it just captures something of this more personalist approach. I'll take a sip, and then I will highlight a couple of phrases. So first, marriage is described as an intimate partnership of married life and love. So there's a strong emphasis on what people are called to by God, this vocation. It's established by the Creator. It's qualified by His laws. It still has, the characteristics of a legal union. But what I'm not going to is the fact that it points to the good of the spouses and their offspring as well as of society. That's maybe 6 lines down. And so this is something that God calls people to, establishes laws around, and it's a place where they grow in holiness. So let me jump down to about 5 lines from the bottom. This is what it says. Through this union, they, the spouses, experience the meaning of their oneness and attain to it with growing perfection day by day. As a mutual gift of 2 persons, this intimate union and the good of the children impose total fidelity on the spouses and argue for an unbreakable oneness between them. And it's interesting to note that even in this document, this modern document on the Church in the Modern World, they're still citing St. Augustine. So his influence is quite long in the development of the sacramental theology of marriage. What I want to really highlight here, though, is that the language it's very idealized, but it's also very hopeful, and it suggests this vision to which spouses are called. Now, just to leap ahead, one of the things we're going to see Pope Francis addressing in Amoris Laetitia is the fact that, there may be an ideal, and certainly God has invited people to consider the ideal, to discern the ideal, but we don't live in an ideal world, and there are barriers to God's grace, and He's very mindful of that. And we'll see in the language of discernment that He's really trying to get to the question, well, what do we do when people fall short of the ideal? That's the real challenge that He's going to be trying to address in the document. So one thing that kind of sets a tone, let me just read this short passage early from the document. He says this. He says, the Second Vatican Council stated that lay spirituality, quote, will take its particular character from the circumstances of married and family life, and that family cares should not be foreign to that spirituality. And that second part is what I want to really focus on. Family cares should not be foreign to that spirituality. And in this, by the way, he's directly citing Apostolicam Actuositatem. So he's quoting it very directly. In order to suggest this, family cares are about just daily life. And daily life, again, is just, it can be messy. It falls short of the ideal. So the challenge is a pastoral one. How do you lead those who are experiencing difficulties, these family cares, toward the fountain of grace that is the sacramental economy of the church? In more ordinary language, how do you keep people invested in the church? How do you keep them in? In other words, how do you, at one time, promote what God calls people to in marriage, and on the other hand, recognize that sometimes people get really stuck and in positions where they simply cannot live up to the ideal. And so in the back of your mind, you should be thinking, situations of divorce. You should be thinking of what I referred to earlier as irregular unions. Perhaps, people haven't gotten married, or one's divorced, one's never been married. Maybe one is from a different religious tradition. There are all sorts of circumstances one can envision, and several of them are unpacked in the document. But again, the point is, how can you keep people in? And more specifically, how can you keep people in if they perceive themselves to be disfavored by God because they don't fit the ideal? That's the pastoral challenge that he's going to continue to unpack in the document. But before we get to it, a little bit more on how to understand discernment and the theology of the family and Ignatian spirituality. So this is the backdrop that helps us to understand some of the language in the document, particularly that word discernment. Okay, so I want to focus on the idea of practices, which are very central to Ignatian spirituality. This is shorthand. Aristotle, specifically Nicomachean Ethics, is a book that very much influenced somebody like Thomas Aquinas, and a major theme throughout the book is that a person becomes what he or she practices. We become what we do. Augustine's way of rendering a similar idea is to say that we become what we desire. So for him, a book like Confessions is a book about his own struggles to navigate the experiences of desire, and his own recognition that sometimes his desires actually led him away from what was good for him. And so we become what we desire. Our task is to develop a discipline of desire such that we come to desire that which is good for us. Somebody like Ignatius says something in a somewhat related vein. He says we become what we imagine. So what grabs our imagination is what becomes a compass point for us. And in his own life, that was the case. He had once imagined himself as a soldier, and he did soldiery things. Later, he imagined himself as a saint. Interestingly, he imagined himself as St. Francis of Assisi and said, I can do that. And, he went off on pilgrimage, and he, tried to imitate St. Francis. But the real challenge for Ignatius becomes this: how do I begin to imagine myself the way that God does? And so discernment is the practice of imagining the world that God calls me to be a part of. That's a shorthand way of explaining it. In the Holy Family, there is this, just nexus wherein Jesus himself is learning practices. His adulthood was formed, first of all, through a childhood in a family. Mary and Joseph have an important role. This painting is Joseph, teaching Jesus how to work with wood. I just think it's a beautiful image. And so one way of thinking about the vocation to the family is to think about the way that God calls us to imagine a family life given the concrete circumstances within which we live. So for parents, one question becomes, who has God created this child to be? It's a question that Mary and Joseph asked themselves. It's a question that parents today can ask themselves. Who has God, created this child to be? This is a theme that my wife Sue and I explore in our book, 6 Sacred Rules for Families. That coming to discern one's role as a parent can be understood to be coming to understand the way that God has created this child, and my role in helping that child to himself or herself discern who God has created him or her to be. So broadly, discernment in Ignatian spirituality has to do with weighing interior movements. So in Ignatius's own life, he experienced them while recovering from battle wounds after just this terrible injury while he was a soldier. He describes it as saying, I had these things that I would read that would make me happy, and I would have this, light feeling, but then later I'd feel depressed and down and not that great. Whereas when I read stories about Jesus and the saints, my heart was lifted. I was given freedom. And so he came to understand initially that that was working on his imagination, that I can come to understand what God is calling to me by paying attention to these interior movements. What is it that attracts me and lifts me and helps me to achieve a greater freedom? So that second bullet point suggests something similar. In prayer, discernment is coming to understand movements as having their source in God or an evil spirit towards consolation or desolation. This is a shorthand way of putting Ignatius's own language. That for Ignatius, the origins of these movements was either God or an evil spirit, and in pursuing these different movements, I would be moved towards greater consolation, which literally in Latin means with the sun. So it's almost like, it's a feeling of, the sun is shining on me and all things are great and everything's looking up, or desolation, which is literally without the sun in Latin. Feeling as if I've got a black cloud over my head. And we even use that language. Everything's wrong today. I've got a black cloud over my head. Discernment is piecing apart where are the movements of consolation and desolation, where is the origin God, and where is the origin an evil spirit. The role of a spiritual director in Ignatian spirituality is to help a person understand movements within the larger context of the spiritual life. And so what we'll see in the document, the Pope's document, Amoris Laetitia, is this strong sensibility that pastors have to help people to understand the movements of consolation and desolation, but keep them involved in the church so that God's grace can attract them more and more. And to say it a little bit differently, the last thing he wants to see is pastors or the church get in the way of God's grace. In fact, interestingly, it's one of the first things that Ignatius says about being a spiritual director. Don't get in the way. I mean, his way of phrasing is that you're to allow God to deal directly with the creature. So allow God's grace to really draw the person into a deeper life of faith, and don't just preach at them or tell them what the ideal is. And again, more on that as we go. So pastoral discernment, broadly speaking, can be described with these bullet points. How can the church help families to become who God has created them to be? Secondly, what are the current social impasses that interrupt God's grace? What gets in the way? What is it that makes people less able to hear God's voice? And then thirdly, how might the church develop new channels of mercy applying the principle of gradualism? So new channels of mercy. How can we find a way around those impasses? And of course, the great strong emphasis this past year in this year of mercy has been, asking the big questions, how can we really broker mercy? How can we really help people to understand the depths of God's mercy? And now, the principle of gradualism. Let me say something about that. What is gradualism? Well, here's the way that he describes it in Amoris Laetitia. Let me quote. Given that gradualness is not in the law itself, this discernment can never prescind from the gospel demands of truth and charity as proposed by the church. And notice, again, the word is discernment. This discernment, what the church is thinking about, can't prescind from the gospel. You can't just pretend the gospel doesn't matter. You can't pretend the truth doesn't matter. Okay, you've got to take into account the truth. Let me continue. Quote, for this discernment to happen, the following conditions must necessarily be present. Humility, discretion, and love for the church and her teaching, in a sincere search for God's will, and a desire to make a more perfect response to it. These attitudes are essential for avoiding the grave danger of misunderstandings, such as the notion that any priest can quickly grant exceptions, or that some people can obtain sacramental privileges in exchange for favors. End quote. Okay, so what he's trying to get at here, again, it has something to do with saying, look, we want to lead people more and more into the depths of God's mercy. But we don't want to pretend like what the church has thought about for 2,000 years doesn't mean anything. We can't just kind of empty the gospel of what it means and say that what Jesus taught us, not that important. Okay, that's the last thing he wants to do. But he does want to have discernment happen. And it involves, remember, those three things: humility, discretion, and love for the church and her teaching. Okay, so those are the ingredients of proper discernment within the context of this gradualism, or what he calls gradualness. So, with that as a backdrop, let's dive into the document itself. And just as a housekeeping note, I'm gonna speak for another maybe 10 or 12 minutes just about the document, and I'm just going to walk us through key parts of it, particularly those that really stress this theme of discernment. It's a word, by the way, that shows up everywhere in the document. I didn't count the number of times, but it's there dozens of times. It's a very, very prominent theme. And what I'm trying to say is that if the role of the church is to help men and women come to an understanding of their vocation to marriage, then the task is to encourage people in practices of discernment, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to be discerning pastors, so as not to just throw a bunch of rules at people, but to really invite them on, ultimately, a pilgrimage. So, Amoris Laetitia 3:25 says the following, quote, "All of us are called to keep striving towards something greater than ourselves and our families. And every family must feel this constant impulse." So what's the greater thing? The greater thing is God. The greater thing is the kingdom. So it's a rich image. And in fact, it's an image that Sue and I use in our book, the one I mentioned, 6 Sacred Rules for Families. That God calls families to be on pilgrimage. So the vocation to family life is like every other vocation in the church. It's a vocation that ultimately has its end in the kingdom of God. So it's not an end in itself. It's always the way to a greater end, which is living in the freedom of the children of God. That is the nature of pilgrimage, regardless of one's vocation within the church. But it's a particular one, and it's one that requires some pastoral discernment. So here's what he says. This is section 6, very early in the document. He says the following, quote, "I will offer an invitation to mercy and the pastoral discernment of those situations that fall short of what the Lord demands of us," end quote. So I was mentioning this earlier. We must hold up the ideal, but, according to Pope Francis, we must also practice pastoral discernment because many fall short of the ideal. So again, much later in the document, section 227, quote, "All pastoral work on behalf of the family must allow people to be interiorly fashioned and formed as members of the domestic church through the church's prayerful reading of sacred scripture. The Word of God is not only good news in a person's private life, but also a criterion of judgment and a light in discerning the various challenges that married couples and families encounter." Right? So we're always talking about understanding the vocation to marriage and the pastoral discernment about marriage within the context of Scripture and the church's tradition. That's always going to be the prerequisite. He says this about the role of conscience. I found this line to be particularly interesting. Section 37, quote, "We also find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful," we, pastors, sometimes we in the church, he says, "who very often respond as best they can to the gospel amid their limitations, and are capable of carrying out their own discernment in complex situations." And here's the money line. "We have been called to form consciences, not to replace them." Great line. We have been called to form consciences, not to replace them. The role of the church, according to Pope Francis, is to draw people into the process of discernment in order, and this was Ignatius's language, that God might deal directly with the creature. So we want to try and invite people to understand what God calls them to in the sacrament of marriage, not just preach it at them. So it's a very pastoral term. Section 72, quote, consequently, the decision to marry and to have a family ought to be the fruit of a process of vocational discernment. Okay, so best case scenario is that the church is consistent enough in its preaching that young people enter into marriage not because it's the thing to do, not because it's economically the best thing for them, not because it's going to give them a tax return or whatever. I mean, the point is that the church's preaching ought to be strong enough that people enter into marriage knowing fully what Christ has called them to before they enter into that vocation. Pope John Paul II talked about remote preparation, and this is very much what is going on in this comment. I think Pope Francis, too, wants to see strong remote preparation, strong emphasis that God calls everyone to a vocation in the church, and to understand what the marriage vocation is that involves these goods, offspring, faith, the sacrament, but even in more ordinary language, it's a call to be a pilgrim with another person towards heaven and to bring children along the way according to God's providence. Some further points about discernment. This title is regarding disparity of cult. That's language from canon law. It just means that people have different religious beliefs. One may be Catholic, one may be something else. It could be another Christian, could be somebody who's Jewish, could be somebody who's Hindu, could be somebody who's nothing at all. And in those situations, that's already a situation that's a little bit tricky. May be a little bit tricky, at least according to canon law. I mean, there's plenty that can be done today that simply was not done even 60 years ago. So if you talk to your grandparents, and if one of them was not Catholic, they will tell you that they could not get married in the church. So it had to do with a very different pastoral approach with regard to this disparity of cult, differences of belief. But here's the way that Pope Francis describes the way that the Synod reflected on this theme. He says this: discernment of the presence of seeds of the word in other cultures, citing Ad Gentes, the Vatican II document, can also apply to the reality of marriage and family. In addition to true natural marriage, positive elements exist in the forms of marriage found in other religious traditions. Okay, so we want to start with the fact that people around the world marry, and we want to use that as the springboard for thinking about even the way that these different cultures discern what God is up to. Now, 249 is in a section that's dealing much more with concrete practical problems in various situations. And here's what he says. Particular problems arise when persons in a complex marital situation wish to be baptized. These persons contracted a stable marriage at a time when at least one of them did not know the Christian faith. In such cases, bishops are called to exercise a pastoral discernment which is commensurate with their spiritual good. And this example, like others, is trying to suggest not a one-size-fits-all approach to the pastoral ministry towards marriage. And that's going to be a major theme. And in the interest of time, I'll jump a little bit and just point to that theme of not one size fitting all. That pastoral discernment means, again, knowing Scripture, knowing the church's tradition, and on top of that, practicing discernment. When faced with difficult situations and wounded families, it is always necessary to recall this general principle. Pastors must know that, for the sake of truth, they are obliged to exercise careful discernment of situations. And that, by the way, was John Paul II, not Pope Francis originally. I'm going to jump over this one. These are here, but just to emphasize how strong is this theme of discernment. I'll say something quickly about marriage prep. So section 207, quote, there are a number of legitimate ways to structure programs of marriage preparation, and each local church will discern how best to provide a suitable formation without distancing young people from the sacrament. So again, best case scenario, remote preparation, young people understand the nobility of marriage, what God calls them to, and enter into it after their own process of discernment, which just simply means in this context, really knowing this is what God calls me to. This is where I will achieve my freedom in partnership with this other person. Now, hard cases, section 242. The Synod Fathers noted that special discernment is indispensable for the pastoral care of those who are separated, divorced, or abandoned. Respect needs to be shown, especially for the sufferings of those who have unjustly endured separation, divorce, or abandonment, or those who have been forced by maltreatment from a husband or a wife to interrupt their life together. All right, so again, not one size fits all. Sometimes divorce happens after, for example, there's been abuse. And in such a situation, yes, of course there is the annulment process and all that sort of thing. But what Pope Francis is pointing to, and the Synod Fathers broadly are pointing to, is that you can't just apply a rule. You have to engage in a discernment process, a pastoral process. Pastoral here, remember, just means the way that a shepherd cares for sheep. So think of the great biblical image, the parable that Jesus uses, of leaving the 99 behind and going after the one sheep that needs to be brought back into the fold. That's, maybe a good rule of thumb, but what does that actually mean for that one sheep? So discernment just means take each person, carefully and understand and listen and allow even the conversation about that person's situation to be itself a process of God's unfolding mercy. More on discerning hard cases here. I will not, in the interest of time, dwell on that. I'll even just say something briefly. I won't read this whole slide, but dialoguing with those unsure about marriage, this is a recognition that ours is a culture that may not always lift up marriage. We want to cultivate the dialogue so that people are just simply attracted to what the church is handing on about what God calls people to in the vocation to marriage. More on irregular situations. Again, I won't read them in the interest of time. I will point to the fact that you see Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, cited a couple of times. And I think my read on this is that this is a way of saying, look, I'm not me, Francis, okay? I am not trying to invent something new here. There's a long tradition of understanding the pastoral imperative of discernment. And he's saying, look, somebody like Aquinas, the great angelic doctor who's influenced, marriage theology and just Catholic theology more than any other figure, and he was talking about this too. He was talking about concrete situations. In that second bullet, it's just a statement that if you can only know one thing, if you know either a general rule or the concrete situation, he says, know the concrete situation. That's more important because the concrete situation is the reality that a human being is facing. That's the discernment process. You have to know the concrete situation. All right, so to summarize, Pope Francis calls for discernment among the faithful themselves, among pastors, and among bishops. Pastoral discernment, secondly, is a form of subsidiarity, which in other words is a way of saying, leave people close to the situation to really do the hard thing about what the situation demands. And the same discernment process allows the church to avoid cold, removed casuistry. And the tradition of casuistry was what developed originally around the sacrament of reconciliation. Basically, if somebody does this sin, give them this penance. If they do that sin, give them that penance. It can be sort of a one-to-one approach. And again, it's not one size fits all. It requires careful listening. Third bullet, emphasis is on the formation of conscience for those yet to be married. I've said things about that. Fourth bullet, emphasis on the principle of gradualism for those in difficult situations. Gradualism, just lead them more and more towards the church. Keep them in the fold. And lastly, the goal is the joy of love as an authentic expression of the gospel. More than anything else, what the document highlights is the necessity of attracting people to the gospel and providing them the means, literally the way to get there, so that they're not excluded from God's mercy. I won't read this prayer to the Holy Family. It's a beautiful prayer at the end of the document. It is here on the slide. It is also in the document, which you can find on the Vatican website. Heck, you can just Google the joy of love, or if you like Latin, Amoris Laetitia, and he closes with this beautiful prayer invoking the Holy Family. And lastly, and I'll close on this point, this is my own information if you'd like to follow up. And in addition to the book I mentioned earlier, are the two that my wife and I are in the midst of packing off to the publishers that deals more with some of these themes, especially discernment. And on that note, I will close and take any comments or questions. I will address the first question that was sent via chat. Do I have any advice for a couple concerning particular issues like mixed faith? Yes, so from the big picture to the more specific. The big picture, again, is that what the document is suggesting is that most important is the beginning of a conversation and emphasizes the discernment process itself. So, practically speaking, what that suggests is that a couple with mixed faith, and by the way, mixed faith, I don't know the particular situation, but generally speaking, mixed faith would refer to somebody who is a couple, one of whom is a baptized Catholic, and then from another religious tradition, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, something else, okay? More recently, there's the question of, well, what about people who are atheists? And that's sort of a different category. But the general point would be simply that any kind of dialogue that focuses on what the meaning of the marriage is from the perspective of Catholic tradition is a valuable conversation. The word conversation, interestingly, means turning together. And that's, to me, a very rich kind of image for what happens in the discernment process. That ideally what happens is that two people are turning more and more towards a mutual understanding and ultimately towards the truth. That's a discernment process. And I would see that process as being very consistent with what Pope Francis is writing about in the document. And the thing about conversation is you can't necessarily put a lock on or know in advance where it takes, where it ultimately heads, but the conversation is still a valuable one. And even from a theological perspective, it's a way of saying that if I am really open to conversation, I'm open to the fact that God has created this person, God has created me, and that we together in turning towards God are more likely to discover God in the process of turning together towards God.
Thanks again, Tim, for presenting, and thank you to everyone who tuned in and joined us this evening. We'll have a recording of this webinar uploaded to our YouTube channel in the next week, so keep an eye out there and on our website, CatholicApostolatecenter.org, for the link. You're welcome to share it with anyone you'd like. As always, our content is free to share. If you haven't yet found us on social media, please like and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram in the hope that we'll continue to reach more people with the message of the gospel. And in the words of St. Vincent Pallotti, may the charity of Christ urge you on. Good night and God bless.